We live in strange times. Technology advances, but faith wanes. Information multiplies, but the truth seems increasingly rare. The world is full of voices, opinions, ideologies, trends, distractions. But amidst all the noise, can we still hear God's voice? Now imagine living in an even worse time, a time when evil grew without limits, where violence was common, where moral corruption dominated society. It was in this scenario that a different man emerged. He was not king. He was not a warrior. He did not lead armies. He didn't build empires, but he did something extraordinary. The Bible sums up your life in a few words, simple words but profound. Enoch walked with God. And then something inexplicable happened. He didn't die. There was no funeral. There was no goodbye. And he was no longer found because God took him for himself. What kind of relationship is this? What kind of life is this? What kind of faith is this? What causes a man to be removed from the earth? Like this? And most importantly, what does this mean for us today, in a world increasingly distant from God? Is it still possible to walk with him? Today we're going to delve into the story of Enoch, not as a distant character from the past, mas como uma voz profética que ecoa para a nossa geração. Get ready, because perhaps Enoch's message is not just inspiring, it can be an urgent calling for your life. The Bible says very little about Enoch, and perhaps it is precisely this silence that makes his story so intriguing. He appears in Genesis 5 in the midst of a long genealogy, a list of names that almost always follow the same pattern. He lived, begat children, and died. But when we come to Enoch, something changes. The text says, "And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah, and Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer found, because God took him." Do you notice the difference? It is not written, "and died." It is written, "God took him." Enoch was the seventh after Adam. He lived before the flood, in a generation that was quickly heading towards total corruption. He was the father of Methuselah, the longest-lived man in the Bible, but his greatest inheritance was not just biological, it was spiritual. Centuries later, the New Testament speaks of him again. In Hebrews 11, the chapter on faith, we read, "By faith, Enoch was translated so as not to see death, because before his translation he received testimony that he had pleased God." Enoch had a testimony. He pleased God. And more than that, in the book of Jude we discover that Enoch also prophesied. He was not just a pious man. He was a voice that announced judgment, a voice that denounced impiety, a voice that did not remain silent in the face of corruption. Enoch lived in a decadent world, but he chose to live differently. While many followed the flow of evil, he decided to go the wrong way. Who was Enoch? An ordinary man, in difficult times, with an unusual faith. And perhaps that's exactly why his story still resonates today. The Bible does not say that Enoch performed miracles. It doesn't say he built something great. It doesn't say he led crowds. She says something seemingly simple: Enoch walked with God. But what does this really mean? Walking with God is not visiting God from time to time. It's not about attending a service sporadically. It's not saying a quick prayer when a problem arises. Walking with God is constancy. It's a daily relationship. It is continuous communion. It is permanent awareness of His presence. Walking with someone requires agreement in direction. Two people don't walk together if they are going in opposite directions. This means that Enoch aligned his life with God's will. If God is holy, he sought holiness. If God is just, he sought justice. If God loves the truth, he rejects the lie. Walking with God also implies closeness. You only talk to those who are nearby. You only hear clearly those walking next to you. As the world around Enoch grew further away from God, he was getting closer. As society plunged into corruption, he cultivated intimacy. And perhaps here is the deeper point. Enoch didn't just believe in God, he lived with God. Today many people believe, but few walk. Walking with God is transforming faith into practice. It is taking God into decisions. It is to consult Him before acting. It's obeying even when no one is watching. It's not perfection, it's direction, it's not religiosity, it's a relationship. And in a world where so many walk guided by trends, emotions, and opinions, the question remains, who have you been walking with? Because in the end, we are all moving in some direction. The story of Enoch reminds us that it is still possible to live close to God, even when the world chooses to go far away. To understand the greatness of Enoch's life, we need to understand the world in which he lived. Enoch lived before the flood, and the Bible describes that period with heavy words. In Genesis 6 it is written, "The wickedness of man will be great upon the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually, violence, corruption, immorality, rebellion against God." Humanity was rapidly moving away from its original purpose. Injustice became common. Sin stopped shocking. Consciousness seemed numb. It was a generation that normalized mistakes, that relativized the truth, who ignored God's warnings. And it was exactly in this environment that Enoch decided to walk with God. He did not live in an easy time. He did not have a society that encouraged him to believe. He had no cultural support. He chose to be different when being different wasn't popular. Now think for a moment. We also live in days of moral confusion. Values are being inverted. Right is often called wrong, and wrong is celebrated as right. Faith is treated as optional, truth is treated as relative, and holiness seems old-fashioned. But Enoch's story proves something powerful. The environment does not determine your loyalty. Even when most choose darkness, you can still choose the light. Even when culture moves away from God, it is still possible to walk with Him. Enoch was not shaped by his time. He was shaped by his communion with God. And perhaps the biggest challenge for us today is this: not allowing culture to define our character, but allow God to define our journey. Because in the days of Enoch, corruption led to the flood judgment. And before judgment came, God raised a voice that walked with Him. Many people know Enoch only as the man who walked with God. But there is something more. The New Testament reveals that Enoch was not just a man of communion, he was a prophet. In the book of Jude we read, "And Enoch also prophesied of these, the seventh from Adam, saying, Behold, the Lord is coming with thousands of his saints, to pass judgment on all, and to condemn all the wicked." Notice something impressive. Before the flood, before the law, before the classical prophets, there was already a clear message. God judges wickedness. Enoch lived in a corrupt generation, and he didn't shut up. He announced that God would come, that there would be accountability, that evil would not go unpunished. His message was not popular, it was confrontational. While the world celebrated its own decadence, Enoch proclaimed spiritual responsibility. He reminded his generation that God is not indifferent. And here's something profound. Enoch didn't just talk about God. He spoke from the presence of God. The authority in his voice came from his walk. He walked with God. That's why I could speak in His name. Today we live in a culture that rejects the idea of judgment. There is a lot of talk about love, but little of holiness, lots of tolerance, but little regret. Enoch's message echoes through the centuries. God is love, but it's also fair. God is merciful, but He is also holy. and one day all work will be revealed. Enoch's prophecy was not just about damnation, it was a wake-up call, a warning before judgment, an opportunity before the end, and perhaps this is the strongest part. Before the ancient world was submerged by water, God raised a voice. And today, are there still voices willing to announce the truth, even when it's not comfortable? Enoch's life teaches us that intimacy with God generates boldness. Those who walk with God do not live in silence in the face of injustice. He becomes a voice that calls for repentance, a voice that points to eternity, a voice that reminds you that this life is not the end. Centuries after his life, Enoch's name reappears, not in Genesis, but in Hebrews 11, the chapter known as the Gallery of Heroes of Faith. Ali estão nomes como Noé, Abraão, Moisés, spiritual giants, and among them is Enoch. The text says, by faith Enoch was translated so as not to see death, because before his translation he received testimony that he had pleased God. And then comes a powerful statement. Now, without faith, it is impossible to please God. This means that Enoch pleased God because he lived by faith. But what kind of faith was this? It wasn't just believing that God existed. It was trusting God when no one else did. It was obeying when culture was moving in the opposite direction. It was remaining faithful in a hostile environment. Enoch's faith was not momentary. It was constant. He walked with God for 300 years. It wasn't a week's worth of enthusiasm. It was not a passing revival. It was a lifetime aligned with heaven. True faith is not emotion. It's a daily decision. It's about keeping moving, even when you don't see the immediate result. It's trusting character of God, even when the world seems to fall apart. Enoch did not have a complete Bible. There was no organized church. There were no examples around him, but he was convinced. He believed that God was real, that God cares. May God reward those who seek him. And here's something transformative. The Bible says he pleased God. Imagine that. Live in such a way that heaven testifies, this life pleases me. This is the greatest achievement anyone can achieve, not fame, not wealth, non-human recognition, but please God. Enoch teaches us that it is possible to live a silent faith, and yet powerful, a faith that doesn't need a stage, but it attracts the attention of heaven. And perhaps the question that remains is, if our generation were described by faith, would we be among those who pleased God? The Bible says something extraordinary about Enoch, and he was no longer found because God took him. No illness, no old age recorded as a final cause, no grave. He was transferred. But what does this mean? The word used in Hebrews indicates being transferred, transported from one place to another. Enoch passed from the earth into the presence of God. This wasn't just an isolated miracle, it was a sign, a powerful symbol. In the midst of a generation destined for the judgment of the flood, Enoch was removed before. This points to something bigger. God always preserves those who walk with him. His life became a living message of hope. As the world headed towards destruction, he walked towards eternity. Enoch's translation reminds us that this life is not everything. There is something beyond. There is reward. There is eternity. There is a God who honors those who seek him. And there is also a prophetic parallel that many scholars note. Just as Enoch was taken before the flood, the Bible speaks of a future time when the Lord will come to seek his own. Enoch's life becomes a glimpse of this promise. It represents the hope that death does not have the final word, that communion with God does not end at the grave, that there is an eternal reality prepared for the faithful. But there is something even more intimate about this symbol. Enoch walked with God so much on earth that continuing to walk with him in heaven was just a continuity. For him, eternity was not a shock. It was just another step on the same journey. This makes us reflect. If eternity started today, would it just be the continuation of our current relationship with God? Or would it be something completely foreign to us? Enoch's translation is not just a supernatural event, it's an invitation to live in such a way that eternity is not a fear, but hope. The story of Enoch is not just an ancient account, it's a mirror. Because the world we live in today, it's not so different from the world before the flood. We live in days of information overload, but scarcity of wisdom, days of constant exposure, but rare intimacy, days when many want to talk about God, but few want to walk with Him. Enoch's message to us is clear. It is possible to live close to God, even when the world lives far away. He reminds us that holiness is not an outdated fad, it's positioning. He reminds us that intimacy with God is not a spiritual luxury, it's necessity. He reminds us that it is not enough to survive spiritually. You have to please God. Enoch was not influenced by culture. Ele influenciou sua geração com sua fé. Today, we are pressured to adapt, flexible values, diluting convictions. But Enoch's life echoes like a call. Don't negotiate your walk. Don't trade intimacy for acceptance. Don't exchange eternity for temporary applause. Today's world values visibility. God values faithfulness. The world celebrates popularity. God observes character. Enoch teaches us that what really matters is not how much we are seen on earth, but how much we are known in heaven. And perhaps the most pressing question is, if God were looking for someone to walk with Him in this generation, would He find you? Because Enoch's message is not just about judgment, it's about relationships. It's not just about the end, it's about how we live now. Amid the noise of our time, God is still looking for men and women willing to walk with Him. And history proves, when someone decides to walk with God, your life never goes unnoticed. The story of Enoch is inspiring, but it was not written just for admiration. It was written for imitation. So how do we walk with God in the 21st century? How to live this reality amidst the rush, social networks, pressures, and distractions? First, prioritize presence, not just religious activities. Enoch did not attend God. He walked with God. This starts with intentional timing, reading the Word, sincere prayer, moments of silence. Relationships grow with closeness. Second, align your decisions with God's will. Walk together and requires the same direction. Before you decide, ask. Before acting, consult. Before you speak, reflect. Small daily choices build a great journey. Third, maintain constancy. Enoch walked with God for 300 years. It was not a passing intensity, it was continuous loyalty. It's not about having perfect days, it's about not giving up when you fail. Bedroom, live differently, even if it costs you. Enoch lived in a corrupt generation. Even so, he chose holiness. Today, perhaps that means saying no when everyone else says yes. It means giving up applause to maintain convictions. Walking with God will not always be popular, but it will always be rewarding. Fifth, be aware of eternity. Enoch lived with an eternal perspective. When you understand that this life is not the end, your priorities change. You start investing in what is eternal, in character, in faith, in the relationship with God. And perhaps most importantly, get started today, not tomorrow, not when things get better. Enoch was not perfect, but it was decided. Walking with God begins with one step of delivery, an alignment step, a step of faith. And the final question of this moment is simple. What will be your next step? The Bible dedicates only a few verses to the life of Enoch, few lines, but what an impact. He didn't build arks like Noah. He didn't part seas like Moses. He didn't take down giants like David. He did something seemingly simple. He walked with God. And that was enough to mark eternity. In a corrupt generation, he was righteous. In a distant culture, he was intimate. In a noisy world, he heard the voice of God. Enoch's life reminds us that greatness in God's eyes is not fame. It's loyalty. It's not visibility. It's proximity. You may never be known by crowds. Maybe your name isn't in history books, but if you walk with God, your name will be known in heaven. And in the end, that's what really matters. Enoch didn't just live. He pleased God. And this is the question that keeps echoing when our story is told. What will heaven say about us? That we live like everyone else? Or that we choose to walk with God? Today, you can decide. In the midst of chaos, walk with God. In the midst of pressure, walk with God. In the midst of distraction, walk with God, because when someone decides to walk with Him, eternity begins now. If this message spoke to you, share it. Leave your comment. And more than that, take the first step. Start your journey today. What if I told you that it is possible to live in a corrupt world and still walk so close to God that it marks eternity? We live in fast-paced days. Days of moral confusion, excess information, constant distractions, and an increasingly superficial spirituality. Never has there been so much talk about faith, purpose, and spirituality. And, at the same time, it has never been so difficult to maintain a deep life with God. Amid this scenario, a question arises that needs to echo in our hearts. Is it still possible to live an authentic, intense, and transformative faith in times like ours? The title of this video is not just an old theme. It is a current alert. It's an urgent call. Enoch, a prophetic voice for today's world, is not just about a biblical character far from our reality. It's about us, sobre esta geração, about the type of Christianity we are living. Enoch lived in one of the darkest times in human history, a time marked by violence, corruption, moral decadence, and distance from God. Sound familiar? The Bible describes that period as a time when the thoughts of the human heart were continually inclined toward evil, a society that normalized error, that relativized the truth, who completely ignored divine principles. Now stop and reflect. Doesn't this sound like the world today? We are surrounded by conflicting ideologies, inverted values, and a culture that constantly pressures us to flex our convictions. Holiness became exaggeration. The truth became opinion. Faith became a trend. And in the midst of this spiritual chaos, many are just trying to survive, when in fact God has called us to live differently. This is where the story of Enoch becomes extremely relevant. He was not king. He was not a military leader. He did not build monuments. He didn't write books. His name appears discreetly on the pages of the Bible, but there is something that sets him apart from everyone around him, something so powerful that it crossed generations and reached us. The Bible sums up his life in one simple yet profound sentence. Enoch walked with God. It doesn't say he just believed in God. It doesn't say he attended a place of worship. It does not say that he had advanced theological knowledge. It says he walked with God. Amid corruption, he chose intimacy. In the midst of violence, he chose communion. In the midst of collective distancing, he chose proximity. This changes everything, because walking with God is not an event. It's a lifestyle. Não é emoção momentânea, it's constancy. It's not a religious appearance, it's a real relationship. And perhaps the most important question we need to ask today is, who are we hanging out with? Are we moving with the culture, with the trends, with popular opinions, or are we truly walking with God? Enoch, A prophetic voice for today's world confronts us directly. He lived in a difficult time, but he didn't use it as an excuse to turn away from God. On the contrary, the more the world became corrupted, the closer it got to the Creator. This is deeply challenging, because it is easy to justify spiritual coldness by saying that times are difficult. It's easy to blame the environment. It's easy to adapt. But Enoch proves that the environment does not determine our loyalty. And here's the point that starts to shake everything. His life wasn't just inspiring, it was prophetic. The question that remains is, what kind of message is our life transmitting to this generation? And that's exactly what we're going to start discovering now. And before we continue this in-depth journey about Enoch, a prophetic voice for the current world, I need to make you a very important invitation. If you really want to understand this content completely, if you feel that this message speaks directly to our generation, then don't watch it passively. Participate. Leave it here in the comments. Do you believe that it is still possible to walk with God in the midst of such a corrupted world? I really want to read your opinion. Your comment is not just an interaction, it is a public declaration of your spiritual position. When you comment, you not only strengthen the channel, but you also help this message reach more people who may need exactly this awakening. And if this reflection has already started to move you, leave a like. A like may seem simple, but it is extremely important. It shows the platform that this content has value, that this message needs to be delivered to more people. In a world where so many superficial things gain visibility, you can help promote a message that talks about faith, character, intimacy with God, and spiritual positioning. Also, if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the time. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because here we don't just talk about biblical stories, we talk about transformation, about spiritual growth, about how to live a practical and relevant faith in today's world. Understanding the content is essential, but applying it is even more powerful. And the more you engage, commenting, liking, sharing, the more you demonstrate that you want to not just hear, but live this message. Now that you have made the decision to take a stand, prepare your heart, because what comes next will show us that the story of Enoch is not just an ancient tale. It is an urgent wake-up call for anyone willing to listen. Now that we understand that Enoch's life was not ordinary, we need to dive deeper into what really set this man apart from his generation. The Bible gives us few details, but the details it does offer are enough to reveal a transformative truth. Enoch lived in a spiritually toxic environment, and yet he developed an intimacy with God that completely set him apart from his time. Imagine the scenario, a society that was progressively heading towards moral collapse, increasing violence, structural corruption, thoughts continually inclined towards evil. There was no incentive for holiness. There was no culture favorable to faith. There was no social pressure to seek the presence of God. On the contrary, everything was conspiring against it. And it is exactly in this context that Enoch decides to walk with God. This teaches us something fundamental about spiritual life. It is not the environment that defines the depth of your faith. It is your decision. Many people today justify their spiritual coldness by saying that times are difficult. They say it's difficult to maintain consistency, that the routine is hectic, that there are many distractions. But Enoch lived in a period where evil was not just an influence, it was the standard. And yet he chose communion. Walking with God involves alignment. It's not just about believing that God exists, but about adjusting your life to His will. It means making conscious decisions every day. It means saying no when it would be easier to say yes. It means choosing character when no one is watching. It means holding on to convictions when everyone around you is flexing theirs. Note something important. Enoch was not isolated from society. He had a family, responsibilities, a routine. He fathered children. He lived enough years to experience the normal pressures of life. The difference was not in the absence of challenges, but in the priority aid that he established. He did not allow culture to define his spiritual identity. Today, we live in a world that values visibility over character. What matters is appearing spiritual, not necessarily being. Social media has created a generation that shares verses but often neglects silent prayer, who talks about purpose but rarely talks about regret. Enoch confronts us because he did not live a performative faith. He lived a relational faith. The expression "walked with God" carries the idea of continuity. It was not an isolated event. It was not an intense spiritual experience followed by years of apathy. It was constancy. It was daily relationship building. This is spiritual maturity. This is real growth. And that's exactly what many of us lack today. Permanence. Another profound point is that Enoch not only walked with God, he also prophesied. The book of Jude reveals that he announced divine judgment on ungodliness. This means that your intimacy generated positioning. He did not remain silent in the face of injustice. He didn't adapt to be accepted. He understood that walking with God entails representing God's character before a lost generation. And here is something powerful for us to reflect on. Whoever truly walks with God inevitably becomes a voice. Not because he seeks the stage, but because he carries conviction. Presence generates authority. Intimacy breeds clarity. Enoch did not need popularity. He needed closeness. Maybe you're thinking, how to live this today? The answer starts with intention. Relationships don't grow by accident. They grow by investment. Time with God does not happen spontaneously in the midst of chaos. He needs to be chosen. Priority reveals love. If God is just one part of your agenda, he will never be the center of your life. Enoch reminds us that spiritual depth does not depend on external structure, but on internal hunger. He did not have a complete Bible. There was no structured community like we have today, but he was aware of the presence, and maybe that's exactly what we need to recover. Awareness. Awareness that God is interested in relationship, not just rituals. Awareness that holiness is not radicalism, it is coherence. Awareness that faith is not speech, it is direction. And the more we think about it, the more we realize that Enoch's life is a direct call to this generation. Not a call for isolation, but for alignment. Not a call to empty religiosity, but to true communion. Not a call to fear, but to maturity. Now I want to hear from you. Do you feel like you've been walking with God, or just talking about God? Be honest. Write in the comments, "I want to walk with God," if that is your decision. Or write, "I need to get closer," if you feel like you need to adjust your walk. I want to read every response, because this dialogue is important. And as you reflect on this, realize that Enoch's story still has something deeper to reveal. If you've made it this far, to the end of this message, that already says something very strong about you. It means this topic touched your heart. It means you're not here just out of curiosity, but because there is a spiritual hunger within you. And that is precious. Now I want to ask you something simple but intentional. Subscribe to the channel, because if this message about Enoch, a prophetic voice for the current world, spoke to you, the next content will also deepen your faith, strengthen your walk with God, and help you live a spiritual life that is more conscious, firmer, and more aligned with the eternal purpose. Signing up is more than a click away. It's a decision to continue growing. If you stayed until the end, I want you to comment on a specific sentence. Write it like this in the comments: "I choose to walk with God." If this is your decision, state it publicly. Your statement may inspire others reading the comments. It could be the push someone needed to make a spiritual decision today. And of course, leave your like. A like is like saying, this message needs to reach more people. It helps this content reach other lives that may need exactly this word about faith, intimacy with God, and spiritual positioning. And don't stop here. The next video appears on the screen. It is the perfect continuation to further deepen this spiritual journey. If you want to grow, mature in faith, and continue developing a solid walk with God, click and watch now. See you in the next video. And remember, the journey begins with one step, but continues with daily decisions.